Hey, Bills Mafia. We know there's only one topic every day. All Bills, all the time. And now Matt Bove and Sal Capaccio are going really deep, talking Bills all year long, because it's always game day in Buffalo.
All right, it's always game day in Buffalo, and we tend to do this once or twice a year. This is a crossover between It's Always Game Day in Buffalo and Buffalo Plus. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the podcast. Sal Capaccio is somewhere on a cruise ship. I don't even know where he is, but he's somewhere around the world. So I called in my friends from Buffalo Plus to join me. Thank you, guys. It wasn't going to be everybody. It was just going to be Mike. And then all of a sudden, Jenna joined, and then Dan felt left out. So Dan is here. So the gang is all together. Hi, guys. I miss everybody. I haven't seen you in a couple weeks.
Hello, Bove. We miss you, too. It's been a while.
I mean, we spent so much time for July to January collectively with each other. I mean, we're always with each other on the road. So when you don't see people for a couple weeks after you're used to seeing them a lot, I mean, I don't need any reason to talk to Mike Catalana, but this is a pretty exciting one.
I was just waiting. I don't like to interrupt. I don't like to speak out of turn. So I was just waiting until these guys have had a chance to talk.
Bove, you might not be able to tell, but I'm rolling my eyes right now.
Yeah, no, and then Dan was the late addition because Dan, you had FOMO, didn't you?
Yeah, 100%. It was just supposed to be Mike. I'm running a family daycare today with my nephews also here. So I wasn't planning on this, and then Jenna was like, "Oh, I'm actually going to be able to make it," and then I pretty much tossed my 1.5-year-old in a crib and said, "I'll go downstairs because I don't want to miss this." She's asleep. She's fine.
Okay, good. Hey, and you did a nice job. I saw you posting about this on X. You managed to get all three of them solo to bed the other day.
My wife went out. She very much deserved a dinner out with her friends, and I had 3 kids, 4, 1.5, and 3 months old, and I got them all to bed, and the only tears were shed were from the girls. So that was good. There were no tears shed by dad.
You know what I think about Bove is that his wife gets this done all the time. Dan acts like he climbed Mount Everest to get it done and gets credit for it, right? Because Renee does this all the time, right, Dan?
Renee does it a lot, especially during the Bill season.
Yes.
We do have help from family. So this was when she asked for, can I go out? My friends are asking me to go out for dinner. I did not hesitate, because she deserves it.
I made a little bit of a mistake the other day because I was doing something with Ellie and I told Andrea how much I had done.
Oh.
She was like, "Don't talk to me like you're not gone for 10 weekends of the year and I'm doing this." She's like, "I really hope you enjoy, your trips to St. Elmo's Steakhouse or wherever you're frolicking around the country." It's like, "Congratulations for doing a Saturday with our daughter." Because I usually am doing a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and usually a Monday by myself too. So they're the real superheroes.
Yeah, there were a couple comments that were like, "Oh, like, does your wife want an award when she does it the other 364 days out of the year?" And I was like, I wasn't asking for it, but it was we survived. That's all. It was survive in advance. The house was all intact, and the kids were all asleep.
Not all heroes wear capes, Dan, and I think that we're here. I think we're heroes, really.
I agree.
Mike, how you riding high after the Super Bowl? For those of you who don't know, Mike is a South Jersey guy.
Yeah.
He's an Eagles fan. So how you holding up? Is this just amazing?
I was happy because the 2 times the Eagles have won the Super Bowl, they beat Brady and they beat Mahomes. So a lot of Bills fans have joined in. I know this year there was only 126 million people that watched the Super Bowl. And so it would have been much higher if millions of Bills fans didn't opt out of the game. But I get it. You're sick of it. I would say if you're a Bills fan and you didn't watch it, go back and watch it because you will love it, especially up to 34-0. So yeah, it was great. It was great to see the Chiefs dominated. Honestly, I got almost as much joy at watching the Chiefs lose as I did in watching the Eagles win, which is really something. I thought it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, it was a massacre. It wasn't even close. It was pretty clear from early on that it was just going to go that way. And I know a lot of Bills fans definitely enjoyed hate watching that Super Bowl. How are we all feeling, though, now that we've kind of shifted into off-season mode? I feel a little differently than I did a couple weeks ago. And I want to get your gauge on this. How do you feel about the Bills, what they did last year, and kind of where they go from here? Jenna, we'll start with you because you haven't talked as much as Mike or Dan.
Well, no, shocking. No, Bove, you say that. I'm curious what your initial takeaway was, and if we are on the same page in terms of some of those things.
I think when the season ended, for a lot of people, you're like, wow, I can't believe it's over. And there's a lot of sadness, and understandably so, right? Your team comes so close to the Super Bowl. But as we got a couple days and then a couple weeks away from the end of the season, I was like, man, they really did exceed expectations. And I really do think that they are building something that they can replicate and get back to that point quicker than they did the last time around. Maybe this is just me being blindly optimistic. Maybe this isn't me. Maybe this is me realizing or taking for granted the magnitude of how close that they ultimately were. But I watched that game against the Eagles or the Eagles game against the Chiefs. And I'm like, I don't know if anybody was beating the Eagles this year. That team is really, really good. They're a juggernaut. So that plays a factor. And then I think about Josh winning the MVP. I think about the offseason that I do believe the Bills are about to have. I think there are reasons to be optimistic. And I think going into next year, the fan base should be even more confident than they have been in a long time. That's just kind of my feel as we are now a few weeks removed from the end of the season.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think for a lot of people, it was the realization of like, this team did overperform the expectations that we thought going into the year. And I think for me, it's like, you see what good coaching, good play from the quarterback, like what a cohesive team can look like on the field and how quickly they ascended to the AFC Championship. Can they get back there? But I agree with you, like being confident in what this team can do. My thing is now it's like, all right, you've been close. You're always close. What is it going to take for you to finally connect and finally be able to take down the Chiefs? Because obviously we saw Philly make it look pedestrian in the way that they were able to destroy Kansas City. So for me, it's like, all right, you really need to focus. And this is Brandon Beane's season right now of like, what free agents do you add? What do you do with your defensive line? What are you going to do with some of the talent players on offense, skill position guys? What are the moves are you going to make that is taking your team that already exceeded what we thought going into this past year? How are you going to bring them to that above and beyond point where you can finally get to the Super Bowl?
The other thing I forgot is how much I love the offseason. And I think that this has kind of reminded me of, oh, now we can talk about all of the fun things that we want to see the Bills do and all of the things we think they should do to get them to that point. So obviously we got plenty of time that we can figure all of these things out. Mike, what's the biggest thing that we need to see from the Bills in the next 2.5 months? What do we need to see?
Here's what I think you should be most optimistic about is the fact that I think the Bills went through that transition and then came out, like you said, on the other end where you're like, you're pretty damn good. Mm-hmm. But I'll say this, talent-wise, I think of everything in like 3 to 5 year periods for a team. That's sort of when the team is together. This should have been the least talented team Josh Allen plays with over the next 3 to 5 years. Yeah. And that's not a slight on any of these players, but I don't see great talent going out of the building. Maybe they were. An example would be Von Miller, who is a first ballot Hall of Famer. But when he goes, he goes. They will replace him, and they should get better at that position with a younger player, or at least have the opportunity to do that. So I think what Beane and the organization did last year set themselves up pretty well for this season. Now, you got to draft well. You got to bring in the right players. It's not just like we have the picks, and I'll let Dan use his phrase about draft picks, but it's the idea that this was not an elite offensive team. This was a defensive team that lacked playmakers, and yet they came within a drive, a few plays of making it to the Super Bowl. It says a lot about Josh Allen, says a lot about the coaching staff in general this year, but I think they put themselves in a good spot. But this is such a big offseason for them to get better at some of those positions. So you're not sitting there in Kansas City going, how did we get close again?
And I think they realize that. I think that they're self-aware to know that they need to do a lot and they need to take advantage of this next kind of window that they're in. We said it took 4 years to go from the AFC Championship back to the AFC Championship. If they have another 4-year window while Josh is in his prime, I think they realize they're going to go all in again. And I think that kind of starts with this offseason. And then we see other win now moves that follow. Last offseason was completely different. The biggest moves that they made last offseason were all of the people they let go or moved on from. I feel like this offseason is going to be very different. Dan, do you get that same sense? Do you feel like we're in for kind of a busy offseason?
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to what Brandon Beane says, that's probably not the case. He once again says they're not expected to be, big spenders in free agency. But I think that's just GM talk. I think Brandon Beane always gives you enough, but doesn't tell you the whole story.
For sure.
And I'm with you. And so, like, what Mike always says is, as we head into drafts, and everybody will have mock drafts and guys they love and this and that. I just don't care. I would rather have a proven commodity. And especially when we go into this draft, and it's been something I feel like I've been banging the table at for a while, is like, I'm so over guys that are versatile. Like, I don't care. I want guys that have one trait and they're better at it than anybody else. Xavier Worthy would have been that example, in meaning he's faster than everybody else. I don't care that he can't run block. I don't want all of my guys to be B's across the board. I'll take a guy that has an A+ trait and then has a couple of C's, and you can coach up some other things. Everybody loves picks until they're players. That's the saying that Mike was, saying that I like to use. But I look at this as there are, and Bove, you and I both talked about it. There's like 5 edge rushers that I think could change the Bills defense for the next 3 years. Mm-hmm. And it's Myles Garrett, it's TJ Watt, it's Max Crosby. There are other guys out there that I sit there and I go, Hendrickson, and you look and you go, man, the Bills are a really solid team from 1 to 53. Brandon Beane deserves a ton of credit for building the roster to be that. But when you look at the top 10 players, the Bills aren't that good at their top 10 players. And you look at the Chiefs and you go, man, their top 10 players are all Pro Bowlers, borderline all pros. And the Bills have the MVP, and that's great. But I think they need some more dudes and just not some more guys, because the Bills got a lot of guys, and that's great. And guys in depth can win you division titles, but you're going to need dudes to win a Super Bowl.
I actually got a little bit of heat for a comment that I made a few weeks ago on the podcast. After they lost, I said the difference between the Bills and the Chiefs is not the difference between Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes. It's the difference between Chris Jones and the guys that the Bills do not have. You think back to some of the ways the Bills have lost these games. Chris Jones has been the difference, right? Like, Patrick Mahomes has made plays, but so has Josh Allen. So that is why I think, like, you've got to go and get one of those guys when they are now all of a sudden available. So let's go to that point. Which one do you want? Because they all come with different costs.
Yeah, and Bove, you just had a really cool interview with Spencer Brown, and he even talked about it like, you're an inch or two short. Like that is where this comes down to. And I used to kind of roll my eyes when Brandon Beane was like, hey, we're not getting run out of the gym here, like all these things. And I think that after the season, there's that immediate blow it all up, start it all over. And I just don't think that's the case. Like, the Chiefs aren't that much better than the Bills are. It comes down to 1 or 2 plays. And so the thought of having a guy that could make one of those plays, a Myles Garrett pushing an offensive lineman into Patrick Mahomes, so maybe he doesn't complete the 3rd down. That's the difference in these type of games with the Chiefs. So yeah, my wish list starts with Myles Garrett, and I would give up a first this year, a first next, a first, a second, and a third, however you want to break that up over the next 2 years, to get Myles Garrett.
Would you give up 2 1s? I would, for sure.
I think honestly, yeah.
I would too. I mean, they're late ones, right? It's like, okay, could you go draft some defensive tackle who 90% of us have never heard of until March that you think is going to make some massive difference on the Bills? Like, yeah, in theory, that could potentially be great, but you're picking 30. So I don't really think that it matters. My favorite option, though, I think, is Max Crosby. Am I crazy, Mike? Did you feel like that's wrong?
No, I like Crosby a lot. I like that he can't stand Mahomes. I think that's a plus.
And honestly, that's part of it.
Yeah.
And I also think the acquisition cost wouldn't be as crazy as Myles Garrett, which is why I think it's my favorite option.
Okay, here's where I will push back a little bit on this. It's easy to say, go get the guy and then forget the draft picks. Now, I'm only going to bring this up because you just talked about the Eagles. So they drafted late in the 1st round and took Quinyon Mitchell. Then in the 2nd round, they took Cooper DeJean.
Yeah.
And then they gave up Hassan Reddick to the Jets and got Bryce Huff. It ended up being basically a trade. That was their big move for Bryce Huff. He wasn't even active in the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Jalix Hunt, a third-round pick, who 2 years ago was playing safety at Cornell, went to Houston Baptist, got drafted in the third round, worked his way onto the roster, and was very good in that game. Josh Sweat, who they basically told work out a trade in the offseason, but came back on a new deal for less money, was dominant in the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
So I'm saying, as you say, can you get guys? If you draft the right guys, you can get guys. I mean, they totally transformed their entire team with those 2 draft picks. Late first round and second round with the 2 corners that they picked. And I'm not saying that fixes everything and that's going to happen all the time, but to dismiss draft picks because you're picking late in the first round, I think it's just because you haven't been happy with what you've done late in the first round, but other teams are. And other teams, I mean, look at the Chiefs. They've made some mistakes, and they've also gotten some pretty good players late in that round, including the guy that Dan just mentioned at wide receiver, who probably would have looked pretty good.
Dan has something he wants to say. He's raising his hand.
Well, it's also the fact of like, I think it's we immediately, it's the newest thing. It's how did the Eagles do it? Is it
Oh boy.
Yep. Just
Can you repeat it?
Can you? Is it repeat? Is it repeatable?
Yeah, that one. Yeah, that one. They also traded a pick and got AJ Brown a few years ago. Yes, they fleeced the Titans, but like they still made a move to get a guy that was an immediate impact. I think
that was similar to what the Bills did with Diggs.
Yeah,
It was a similar kind of move. Yes, and that was a good move for the Bills.
And it had immediate impact. So like, I guess that we're sitting here going, is Dwayne Carter going to be, where is he going to be? And Javon Solomon. And like, we're sitting here going like, not to use the Eagles and say like, look at how they did it. They got Quinyon Mitchell and they got Cooper DeJean. Like, okay, that doesn't always work because sometimes you end up with Kyer Elam at the end of the first round. And
so my point is that, so then what's different than, I mean, I know you say the established guy and that's great, but he better make that kind of impact. And you're also getting guys going to make a lot of money and he's 29 years old. So it's just a different way to do it. If you believe that edge rusher is going to be the difference and you want to give up 2 ones, it may be the greatest thing. I'm saying is I think we're looking at it from the lens of draft picks not being impactful for this team.
Correct.
Now we say that in the draft from a couple of years ago, you got 4 guys you're going to sign early because they've all been really good. And I think they'll be really good on this team as it goes forward. But I'm saying is you are giving up something if you're going for that one player.
Except for that guy in the first round.
Yeah. You had a couple SUNY guys trying to figure out what words to use with Dan and I, and the Ithaca and the Syracuse grads are sitting there judging the 2 of us. And they're like, oh my gosh.
Nope.
They can't.
Now we just know when to lay out on those and let Dan cook. That's what we did.
just you could see the wires kind of starting to cross.
He was into it though. He put a lot of effort into it. It was close.
Yeah.
He was close.
My head hurts.
Jenna, if it's not edge rusher, assuming they're going to do something on the defensive line, what is the next thing that they need? What is the next biggest hole on the Bills?
Real quick on the last point, I just feel like I know what Mike is talking about of how impactful draft picks can be. And you talk about that draft class of not Kyer Elam. Well, everyone else but Kyer Elam, essentially.
Yeah.
But I think for right now, where this team is at, where Josh Allen is at in his career, he is in his prime. These next couple of seasons, I think it's also now important to get a guy that's bona fide or whatever. I say the word wrong, but a guy that's a proven talent because you're trying to capitalize the most right now. And I think there's players throughout the draft that they can get really good. They can develop. That's the whole point of drafting them. But don't you want someone right now who's going to be able to immediately make an impact out on the field? And that's why I totally understand draft picks can be so useful. You can get a ton of guys. It just also depends on if you pick the right guys.
Yeah.
But it does take time for a player to get acclimated, to get up to speed. And for a lot of these players, sometimes they need a couple of years to do that. And so sometimes I think, why not right now? It would cost a lot, but the point of you're picking late in the first round, you're already having, not the most top talented guys because of where you're picking. Why not get someone that could be right there on the field making plays right out of the gate?
I want to be clear on something here. I do think they could do this, and I think it could work really well to get a great player. I'm just saying is, Cleveland is now, and I think it's just lip service saying they're going to try to sign him and whatever.
Yeah,
somebody's going to pay him. I think he wants out. I think they're going to just build up the market and eventually trade him. I'm saying to you is, if that does not happen and they don't want to make that move for a major player, whether Crosby becomes available or not, you still have outlets to go and get players and draft the right ones and have them step in and be impactful. I think that is still there. You get younger, maybe more athletic, and you can do it. Hey, you bring in Myles Garrett and turn him loose, that would be great.
Yeah.
I think he makes everybody around him better, but it is a risk because of age and money.
I also think some people are a little shy about it because they're like, well, Von Miller, just that experiment went horribly wrong. Obviously, he was a free agent, but it's like, I made the analogy on Buffalo Plus. It's like, you date someone, you break up. Does that mean you're never going to date again? It's like, you got to keep taking swings. You got to keep trying, because just because one thing didn't work out doesn't mean another guy who's a totally different player can't be the perfect fit in what you're trying to do.
And the other thing there is that we talk about one or two plays. Before Von Miller got hurt, he was making one or two plays that won them games. We talk about the Ravens game in week 4, a couple years ago, his first year. He made multiple plays in that game that kept the Bills in the game. In the Chiefs game, he gets the sack in the game that forces them to punt. The Bills go down and score. And then at the end of the game, he forces the pressure that leads to the Taron Johnson interception that seals the win. So Von Miller didn't work out, but I think it was very much circumstance. It wasn't the idea. I still think that the idea, in theory, was the right thing, and that should not scare them away from swinging for the fences again. And I do think they will be, but then we go back to what else? It's not just defensive line. There are other areas where this team desperately needs to have more talent. What is the next most important position this offseason? Jenna, you can start this one.
I mean, I think that's the thing. When you look at this roster, there's a lot of spots where you're like, they need wide receivers. Like, they need guys that can catch the ball. They just, I think of what they were able to do, and players like Mac Hollins just playing above and beyond what anyone expected. But the talent level on this team, they overperformed with what they had. Absolutely, undoubtedly so. But you need to get guys, like Dan said, that are dudes. You need, and whether that be through the draft or whatever you want to do in that circumstance, I do think we're at the point where it's like, okay, Josh Allen can prove he can do more with less, but what about what he can do with more? I want to see that too.
Yeah. And yes, I agree with that. I think the secondary needs a bit of an overhaul, and not in total. I mean, I think Taylor Rapp showed enough that you would have him back there, and obviously Christian Benford is a priority, but they need upgrades at corner. They need, younger, I'm going to say. And they need another safety. I don't think there's any question. They need to be more athletic in that secondary. We always talk about the things that Spags does, and Spags can do this and whatever. It's also got the guys that can play that way. And I don't know if the Bills can play that way, or at least with this current roster. So I think that's the part that has let them down. I think the talent level needs to go up in the secondary. You're right about wide receiver. Like, you just want, and does that mean you take a flyer on somebody? Is it a Chris Godwin who's coming off injuries, but he has shown the ability to make plays, and he probably would cost a lot less? I don't know, but they do need that. They do need a one on this roster offensively so that everybody else fits more in their role.
We think they're done with Russell Douglas collectively. Do we think that they move on from him, or do you think there's a world where they bring him back? Because if they bring Russell Douglas back, their secondary is going to look very similar to what it did going into the Chiefs game. It's going to be Russell Douglas and Christian Benford and Taylor Rapp and Cole Bishop and Taron Johnson. So we can talk about like them needing to improve, but all of those guys then would be back. And I don't see any of them, like, besides Russell Douglas, where else are there going to be changes? So if we think they need to make changes in the secondary, I think he's the only logical place of where you go, okay, that's the place that they move on from, right?
Yeah, and I'm okay with Rasul Douglas coming back, but I think it can't be at what we thought his price was going to be maybe 4 or 5 weeks into the season.
Yeah, it's gonna be like $5 million.
Yeah, like it really kind of be like, hey, Rasul, this is what we want you at. You can go else and see, and if you get more money, more power to you. But this might be one of those, even like Poyer, like kind of went out, tested the market, and then was like, oh, there's not the money out there that I thought, and I'm maybe not as highly sought after as once my impression was. So I'm okay with it, but I don't want it to be at this market value that he was, midway through the season.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think there's a chance Rasul comes back and then they draft a corner with a day 2 pick, kind of like they've done with Dorian Williams and Terrell Bernard, where that ends up being the guy waiting to eventually take over, but can also be your primary backup. So I think that's the most likely outcome. But I also wouldn't hate if they went out and signed somebody in free agency to be an improvement. Like, I don't know if this would be like a DJ Reed thing or if there's another corner that they like who they think could make them better. But I don't think that that's out of the realm of possibility. But I do think wide receiver is more important. They desperately need another wide receiver.
Yeah. Yeah. And Bove, do you know what would make their secondary better?
Let's hear it. I don't know.
An elite pass rusher. A defensive line that gets some form of pressure on the quarterback.
I will
improve them.
And I will say that when you look, you can be more impactful sometimes too. They need pressure on the inside. I think that has let them down.
Yes.
It's great to have the edge pass rusher. There is no doubt in my mind. But man, you see teams that can get pressure up the middle and really impact it and open things up for the guys on the outside. And they haven't done enough of that. I mean, Ed and Daquan have been good players, but not game wreckers. Yeah, and I think sometimes that's been missing. Now, this is also a draft loaded with defensive tackles. Yeah. So you pick the right one. It's a rotational thing on that D line. You work the guy in there and you find somebody who can make plays for you internally. I think that can open things up, whether it is Myles Garrett on the outside or, Greg Rousseau. It certainly helps everybody if there's pressure on the inside.
Yeah, and then you also have to factor into the guys that you have that you still don't exactly know what they are, right? So we're talking about 2 positions. We're talking about interior defensive line and we're talking about wide receiver. They used 2 day 2 picks on those positions last year. And I think it's a very incomplete grade from Keon Coleman and from Dwayne Carter. So those are other players that could potentially factor in. I am not saying, though, that either of those guys should make you steer away from selecting a player at those positions early in this draft. I absolutely do not think that's the case. But I do expect growth and steps in the right direction from both of those players. The Keon we saw before injury was so different than the Keon we saw after injury. I remember talking to Mike and Jenna in Seattle after the game and being like, hey, Keon Coleman might be pretty good. And then the next week he got hurt and then he was never the same after that.
Yeah.
Game.
Yeah. And it was interesting as to how outwardly critical they were of that.
They were sending a message. They were sending
Yeah.
And I think that is all part of becoming a pro. I mean, you could follow the Terrell Bernard way of like, we didn't know anything about what the guy could do.
Nothing.
And then you see when he comes back year 2 and how good he is. But you mentioned those 2 guys. Cole Bishop is another one.
Sure.
Because the thought is he's going to step in there. And you're going to want to see real growth out of him next year. He showed flashes, of course, but they didn't trust him for most of the year. And now you got to say, I think he's penciled in, right, as the starter for next year.
Yeah.
But he's got to go out and show that growth. He got hurt in training camp, but that is a key position for this team. If he can develop into a really good player, because now you're talking about 3 guys going into that second year in Keon at a wide receiver position, Carter as a defensive tackle position, and the safety position. All guys you drafted. Now you got to see them in year 2.
Let me ask you guys this. Let's take Myles Garrett off the table because I feel like that might be a little bit too much of a layup. If you could add any potentially available player to this Bills roster next year, who would it be and why? Dan, you can start.
Meaning like a free agent wise?
Free agent or somebody who's been rumored to be available in trades. Obviously, you could throw in draft picks, but like there's really not anybody who, Abdul Carter, but that's not going to happen.
Right. Yeah. Mike makes a good point too about Godwin because he's a guy that can separate, and he's a guy that is a reliable target. Like I think he's got more wiggle and more juice. Obviously, we're coming off a torn ACL, but he's gotten more. He's like a Khalil Shakir plus, like a guy that can be very friendly to throw to and things like that. So I'm still like, I still, when I break down the end of the season and I know what the defense was, I know they have their limitations, but they still had the ball again with a chance back-to-back years. And I just didn't see, sometimes it turned into who's Josh going to throw to? Like, he still is making big third down throws to Matt Collins. And that's not a knock at Matt Collins. That's just a kind of a knock at what this wide receiver room was. The Amari Cooper just didn't, it just didn't work out. But again, going back to Jenna, like, you don't stop dating. Like, you don't just sit there and say like, okay, we're done. Like, the thought was there. Like, hey, results are sometimes what they are. Again, you can't bank on Von Miller tearing his ACL. I mean, Amari Cooper, another guy injured to some respects, but you got to perform there. And to have more options that defensive coordinators go, we have to take this guy out. Like, we can't let this guy beat us, because for as good as Khalil is, and I think he's really good, Khalil's really good games are still 7-8 catches for 80 yards. Like, you need a guy that can consistently, like, I'm not saying that, it's kind of like that, a DK Metcalf kind of guy, like a guy that you go, man, you can't let this guy beat us today. And if you let up for one play, Josh can make it really hurt.
Yeah.
All right. How about you guys? Give me a name.
I love Max Crosby. I just think he wouldn't cost as much as Myles Garrett, and just he's a Chief hater. I honestly think that does play into it. That does matter, like the kind of the bad blood there, and just the plays that he could be able to make. And when you add in a guy like that, it makes everyone else better as well, because you have to figure out, where is he going to be? What is he going to be doing? So for me, it's pretty simple. I just think it's pretty wild, considering how much the Bills have invested in that D-line, how many resources they have used, how much money, and it's still like, hey, you need to find a weapon on that side of the ball. But I think it's that, and I'm going to say Max Crosby.
Mike?
Is it somebody who's available, or it's just like a wish list?
Pie in the sky?
No, it's going to be somebody who's somewhat available.
But I do want to hear who your other one was.
Who's my other one?
Zach Ertz.
Oh, I love Zach Ertz. Let me tell you
Mike
something.
loves Zach
And you
Ertz.
saw the way Zach Ertz played. The problem Zach Ertz would have in Buffalo is the uncatchable balls that the MVP quarterback throws. Because everybody is giving me the nerd numbers, telling me that the reason the number 1 draft pick tight end didn't catch more passes is because it's Josh Allen's fault.
Oh my gosh.
If you're wondering, Mike chose violence today.
Well, I mean, come on.
Mike did a whole rant on our latest podcast, and it was about bringing more hate into sports. It was about
sports hate. Yes,
sports
that's important.
hate.
That's
important. Yes, not about the individual people.
That the four nations,
the rivalries,
has brought hate back. But it was pretty good.
It is.
Incredible.
I love Zach Ertz as a player. I have said Dalton Kincaid isn't Travis Kelce to me. He's Zach Ertz, who's a pretty damn good player who has come up in big moments, and you saw him in Washington. The only reason I bring that up is Dalton Kincaid is another guy they need a lot more out of.
Yes.
I'm hopeful that what they've talked about with him, with the knee, really was that impactful, and that he comes back next year with another gear, because we were told he had that other gear. And then again, I'm only picking on the people who give me the numbers and tell me he had so many uncatchable balls in the games. Josh seemed to throw pretty good ones to the rest of the team. So I want to see what happens this year with him. The guy I was going to throw out there is, you guys are going to laugh when I say this, but it's AJ Brown.
What?
The reason I bring that up is AJ Brown has been great for the Eagles.
Some light reading.
Yeah.
I have something in my mind. I could see Howie Roseman. This is just my 2 cents. I don't know anything. Saying this would be the time to make a move. This would be the time to make a move. Devontae Smith could be a number 1 on most teams.
Yeah.
I mean, he just could be. They draft younger. They play mostly 2 wide receiver sets. They draft younger, maybe bring in another veteran and make a deal. Now, AJ Brown is a guy who can put up big numbers. In the Eagles offense, he became still impactful. Now, I'm just throwing this out there, but he's still at a younger age. He's already gotten paid. I'm just throwing that out there. So if you want to call Howie up, maybe it's not good to deal with Howie, but I just have this weird feeling that at some point in the offseason, you may hear he's on the market.
I can call Cousin Nick. and put
That's
in a good
right.
word. If you
That's
want me
right.
to. I can call cousin Nick. What were you
And
saying?
there, yeah, and you're talking
Well,
about a guy. He's had a knee
Yeah.
sort of thing, but he's
got
still
two
a
knees.
beast. Yes.
Yes.
But
Bad joke.
the other one too, like I was kicking the can just around with one of our friends that's a reporter in Pittsburgh about like what level do they need to reset their defense, because if you want to talk about a closer, a guy that makes those plays, the reason they brought Von in, TJ Watt has made those plays for a decade and played through injuries. Like he does kind of have that Buffalo grit, toughness that you kind of think of. And again, getting him in more games where the team that he's facing isn't just running the ball out, because he can strip it at any time, but just the fact of letting him pin his ears back. I know he struggled at the end of the season, which is what also makes it think that, like a Max Crosby, it may not be as expensive to make the move. It would be a massive reset to the Steelers defense, but they need to rework a lot of things over there in Pittsburgh. And that could be one of the moves where you're saying, hey, I don't think he had a sack or a tackle in his last like 10 games, but that team was a free fall, of free falling at the end of the season. I would love, again, another guy that you just sit there, and the Steelers motto for the last 5 years has been keep the game close and then let TJ Watt have a strip sack. And it's constantly worked. So if you're looking at a guy that could be another impactful edge rusher guy, I don't know, like TJ Watt is another guy that you think of splash plays, right? It was like what Terrell Bernard has been and what Tremaine Edmonds wasn't, are the wild plays. Like I can think of like 10 plays off the top of my head where you're like, hey, TJ Watt needs to make a play here. And he does. Like, that's just who he is. So like, that's another guy where, again, whatever the price may be, maybe it's less than Myles Garrett. But again, those are the calls that I would be making if I was Brandon Beane.
I have two. One of them, there's absolutely no chance it happens. One of them, there's probably not any chance it happens, but it's still really
These are the best ones. Go ahead.
These are the best ones. The one that there's no chance that it would happen is Garrett Wilson. I don't know what the Jets are going to – they're never going to trade that guy in the division. They just wouldn't. But that guy has to be so fed up with the way the last couple of years have played. They go and bring up Devontae Adams, and then they bring him, and he becomes the number one. Garrett Wilson gets pushed to the back burner. Like that, he is a legitimate number one wide receiver who is just wasting away on a team that now has no idea what they're going to do at quarterback. Are they really going to bring back Garrett Wilson for another year of Tyrod as their quarterback and then have to pay him an insane amount of money?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Right? If they're not figuring out what they're doing with corner or quarterback, don't you think it would be smart to go get some big time assets? The problem is the division. They're not trading them in the division. The one that's probably not going to happen, but is super interesting to me, is Micah Parsons. Parsons, they can't pay everybody. They just, I understand the salary cap isn't real. I get it, Dan. I know you're pointing at me. They just gave CD a ton of money.
Yeah.
They just gave Dak a ton of money. Trayvon Diggs is going to get a ton of money. Micah Parsons, I think, is still 24 or 25 years old.
Yep.
You want to talk about giving up a haul? Whatever Myles Garrett costs, I would do the exact same thing.
Yep.
If Micah Parsons is on the table, strictly because of his age. And then you sign him to a massive deal, and you put Greg Rousseau on the 5th-year option, and then you franchise tag him. And then for the next 2 years, those are your two edge rushers, and watch out. That to me, there is not a price I would not be willing to pay for Micah Parsons.
You are talking about a guy that is 4 to 5 years younger than Myles Garrett.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
yes, that's the
when
whole
you're giving
point.
up those assets, it's basically like a draft pick, but you got to pay him. Dan, go ahead.
Why is he laughing?
I don't know.
No, I'm just thinking about a Dallas sports fan and their team trades Luka and Micah Parsons in a span of like 2 months and just being like, what is going on? And it's like sitting there being like, boy, the Mavs made a horrible trade. And then Jerry being like, hold my beer. I'll take Micah for a second and a third. You guys want to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and throw in Javon Solomon. That's the other piece that you have to throw into. And like Bean's like, oh, okay, like yeah. Deal. I just that just made me laugh thinking about like the Dallas sports talk radio would just be fire for a week straight.
But you do have to. I always say this: take advantage of dumb teams, and the Cowboys have been a dumb team. They draft well. They bring in good players. They don't have any idea how to pay them and to do it. They made Dak wait and wait and wait. They should have signed him earlier. when he was a little younger. They could have given him the deal at that time. And CD Lamb, it's almost like they want to anger them before they pay them. And every player in that locker room sees that. It's not necessarily always about the money. It's almost like they want to make them wait till the very last minute. Smart teams would sign them early, especially like you said, a young player like that. Either sign them early or deal them. And it could happen. I don't laugh when you say that. It probably won't. It could happen if they get to the point they say, we're going to move on from this guy because we're not going to pay him.
I was sitting on the other side of an aisle to Matt Perino on a flight this year. I don't remember where we were going. And I looked at him and I was like, does Micah Parsons for the Bills make sense? And he was like, why would the Cowboys ever do it? And I was like, because they're dumb. And he was like, oh, yeah, it's a good point. And I was just like, and I think back to that conversation kind of a lot. And then in the last few weeks, his name has started to pop up. So it's interesting. One last football question, and then we'll wrap up. How much do the Bills pay James Cook, and do they pay James Cook? What is the number? You guys can start. Jenna, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Mike.
Well, it's not $15 million a year. Let's start with that.
Yeah.
James Cook's a good player. It's funny when the Saquon thing happened, and we've all seen that conversation with the young guy in the Giants front office when there's like, who's going to pay him? Like somebody that like needs a really impactful player. And they're like, well, there's other running backs out there, Shane says. And he's like, basically, there's not that many Saquons. You got Saquon, you got McCaffrey when he's healthy, and you got Henry. Mm-hmm. And maybe Jacobs, like depending on how you look at it. Cook wasn't there yet. Really good, very impactful to the team. He should get a really nice deal from this team. But my priority is corner and maybe even linebacker before running back in terms of my priority for this team. So you're going to pay him, but I'm not breaking the bank and setting a new number for running back on a team that has Josh Allen as the quarterback.
Yeah. I think that's honestly really fair and kind of how I feel of like, and if you are going to pay him that kind of money, he has to be the focal point of your offense. And I just don't think the Bills are willing to do that, especially when you have Josh Allen.
Dan, what's the number? If there is a number, they don't have to. They don't have to give him an extension.
Yeah, I think it's 10 or 11, maybe max. And like I keep going back to like there needs to be the philosophy of the offense has to match. While I do not believe the salary cap is real and you can work however you want, but you also set values of players and at positions. And Bean's another guy that has found value at times in the draft with running backs in second and third round. So it's a weird time. We were talking about it on the latest podcast for Buffalo Plus. Like it's a weird time to make this stance and to come out and swing for the fences and say 15 million. Hats off to James Cook. Like I'm never going to sit there and say a player shouldn't fight for his money when we're talking about millions of dollars. That's nothing that the four of us have ever going to need to negotiate for. But you can't sit there and say, the Bills can't sit there and say, we're going to pay somebody 12, 13, 14 million dollars, whatever the number is, for a guy that's only going to get 50% of the snaps. And right now the philosophy, much like the wide receiver room has been in the running back room, it's everybody eats. And so while James Cook has been emerged as a true playmaker outside of Josh Allen, he was the most explosive playmaker for the Bills this season. They still don't see him as a complete back. They still have a role for Ty Johnson. Ray Davis has still filled in nicely at times. So it is kind of tough to sit there and say philosophically, hey, we're going to pay a guy $10+ million and he's going to get 52% of the snaps. Like there has to be a change there with what they're going to do offensively before they can come to a number that the two can maybe meet halfway at.
Yeah, my number is like 11.5, 12. It feels like that's probably where it ultimately ends up ending at, but
yeah,
we'll see how it goes. All right, this is the last question for me. It's not really a Bills question. I was going to set you up with asking you guys, what do I love more than anything? But then I thought you would all say like Chipotle. So then I preface it in that way. Give me the thing that I love more than anything, football, is the NFL schedule. I have no idea why. I'm just obsessed with the NFL schedule. We are months away from this happening. Bills week 1 opponent is who?
Ooh.
The possibilities are so fun.
Yeah.
That's why I ask, because none of this matters. None of us are probably even going to be right. Nobody would have picked Arizona last year.
Yeah, that's
but
true.
I feel like there are some fun, spicy potential week 1 matchups.
Spicy.
Yeah, Dan.
Ravens Sunday night.
That's what I
could
said
that.
the other day. I was like, right,
Yeah.
it's perfect. You get the whole MVP thing that you're coming off of.
Yep.
They like
That
for
makes the
some
most
reason
sense.
the Ravens in a big window early in the season. That one, I have another backup one. So okay, that's a good answer. What about you guys?
I don't know. I want the Bills to go to Madrid.
I don't.
I think
I
it's
want that.
how come I keep hearing about Ireland?
That's
Well,
yeah.
because they play Pittsburgh on the road.
Yeah.
And it for a while seemed like that was going to be the Packers, but now I feel like that has lost some steam. And I mean,
The Packers just went to Brazil last year.
yeah, that's
too.
what I mean. Last year against Philly, I would be very in on Ireland. Of
Yeah.
all of the
Yeah.
international trips, that is the one I would want to go on the most.
Yeah.
Not
Well, it's-
Madrid?
I've been to Spain. I haven't been.
Oh,
to Ireland.
okay. I didn't realize. that.
Selfishly, it
Yeah.
would be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure they're consulting with you.
Yes.
Yeah, no, they are. They are. We're having those conversations. So, who do you think it is though to start?
I love that Ravens one.
Yeah.
It's funny how the Bills got put in like one of the lamest opening games. I mean, against an AFC West team at home Sunday at 1:00.
But they
last
weren't
year.
expected to be anything.
I was to say, I think that's
Yeah.
indicative of what they
So-
thought the
and
team
how many,
was.
How many primetime
My
games
Arizona
did they have for the
Cardinals.
year?
Bove's Arizona
My
Cardinals.
Arizona Cardinals and my Miami Dolphins.
How many primetime games did they have this past year?
The Bills?
Yeah.
I think they were scheduled for 5 and then flexed into a 6.
Right. So they were still
Yeah.
scheduled for 5.
Yes.
I mean, it just is a weird opening day. And I think they're back into that because what do you
Yeah.
have? You have the Thursday night game, you have the Sunday night game, you have the doubleheader Monday night, right?
Mhm.
For
Yeah.
opening weekend.
Yeah.
So, and the Ravens game is in Buffalo?
Ravens game's in Buffalo.
Yeah, in Buffalo. Yeah, that fits.
Their
My,
home schedule's a buzzsaw.
Their home schedule is a buzzsaw. Mike kind of teed it up. My other not Ravens one is also AFC North. I could see them getting the first of the doubleheader against the Bengals on Monday Night Football to start the
be.
season.
Yeah.
You get Allen, you get Burrow. It's a good matchup, but it's not one that they're saving. It's not like that one would be like, oh, we got to save that for December for a CBS 425 window. Like
That's
that
fair.
feels like it could be a fun one to get out of the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, guys.
Okay.
Anything you want to ask? Anything we didn't talk about? I mean, there's a lot we didn't talk about.
Yeah.
but
No.
I don't want to
So
keep
when
you
are
all
we-
day.
When are we fighting?
I didn't like that comment on social media the other day. I didn't like
see
that.
it.
About the
Dan-
Rochester
Yeah, Dan said for somebody who claims to love the movie Miracle so much, he should know that he's talking about Rochester, Minnesota. My counter to that would be, he says throwaway game up in Rochester. Up would not be Rochester, Minnesota. That is south of where they would be. So that doesn't make any geographical sense. So I've thought about this a lot. So
So
either
Herb was going
Well,
off a
they-
map. Like
So
that's
either
what
it was-
Herb
it
was.
was- so-
Well,
Herb's
they came
speech.
with receipts.
it was poorly written, the line. Also, it does make sense if you're in Lake Placid to think of because I mean, what's relatively close to Lake Placid? Syracuse, Rochester, right? Like those are the other places that are relatively close. I do agree that it's Minnesota, but the movie came out in 2004. There's no way 11-year-old Matt Bove has any idea that Rochester, Minnesota exists.
Yeah.
So when
that's
you
fair.
hear it, then
you
you
think
just
of that. Yeah.
you think of it's like the Leonardo DiCaprio meme pointing at the TV like, hey, I have family in Rochester. I've heard of Rochester. That's
Yeah.
cool. And then
Yeah.
for the rest of your life, you operate on that. And then until like you're 32 years old and the light bulb goes off of, wait, there's a Rochester, Minnesota. Because that's what happened to me 3 days ago.
yeah.
And then I kind of started something online.
But we
because-
are the Rochester. Like there's Rochester, Michigan. There's a Rochester Hills, I think, and there's
I didn't
Rochester,
know that.
Minnesota. There's obviously Rochester in England.
Mhm.
But we are Rochester, New York.
Bove,
Is the
I-
Rochester.
I was absolutely the 11-year-old kid in the movie theater being like, that's us. But then my brain developed and I was like, oh, I was like,
Wow.
oh, it's,
Bove.
probably, it's probably not when half the team is from Minnesota.
you know,
The 1980s living up.
my counterpoint to that would be if Rochester was so great, there would only be one of them. Like there's only one Grand Island. I think.
I think
There's got to be another.
I think.
Probably.
Real
There's
quick,
probably
that's what-
several.
Bove, I
That's the
heard
last one.
something about not the movie, but the game itself.
Okay.
Al Michaels and Ken Dryden, former Cornell goaltender,
Uh-huh.
NHL with the Canadians. After that game, the U.S. wins, craziest game ever. They called the next game live for 3
Shut
hours.
up.
ABC, Al Michaels said ABC had them do it because they were playing the taped game and they were concerned there could be any sort of issue with the broadcast. So he had to stay there and do the next game, which I think might have been Sweden. I'm trying to think who was in the next game.
Well, they played Sweden, Finland, I think.
Yeah. So they called that next game. So after that moment, do you believe in miracles? Al had to go right back into the booth and call another game before he got to the gold medal game a few days later. That's wild.
That's absurd.
Yeah.
You know what else is absurd? There's a Grand Island, Nebraska. So
that's what I think of when I think of that's the grandest.
That's the grandest.
If I'm ever gonna be the town supervisor, it's gonna be in Nebraska. I'm gonna be the Grand Island, Nebraska town.
I am gonna be on a Google search. I'm gonna find another Grand Island because there's gonna be more.
Thank you all for joining.
Thanks,
I very much
Bove.
appreciate it. Thank you, Buffalo Plus, everybody. You can follow all of their work on YouTube, on television, anywhere you get all of your Bills content. We are going to be teaming up with them a lot over the next couple of weeks with the combine coming up.
Yeah.
Then after that, free agency, and then after that, the draft, and then the schedule, and then a couple weeks off, and then back to Rochester for training camp. Thank you, guys. I appreciate all of you.
Rochester, New York for training camp. It's New York. Don't go to Minnesota.
Bye, Bove.